They found her name carved into the wood behind the church altar. Not in English, not in Latin, but in a language no one had spoken aloud for over 200 years. And the moment it was read, 3 children vanished. There are names history erases not because they are unimportant, but because they are dangerous. Tituba is one of those names. Most Americans are told her story ended in 1692, swallowed by the Salem witch trials, dismissed as superstition, hysteria, and fear. A slave woman, a convenient villain, a footnote. But that is not where this story ends. Because long after Salem was buried beneath textbooks and tourism, Tituba's shadow continued to move, quietly, deliberately, through American soil, through orphanages, churches, seminaries, and small towns where memory itself was treated like a crime. Between 1811 and 1949, across the eastern seaboard and the deep south, there were places where children stopped dreaming, where women whispered prayers backwards, where church bells rang with no hands pulling the rope, and in the margins of forgotten journals, burned parish records, and sealed court transcripts, the same names surfaced again and again, not as a woman, but as a ritual. What you are about to hear is not a story about witches. It is a story about control, about how institutions learned to weaponize fear, about how slavery never truly ended, it only changed language, and about how one woman's voice, stolen and distorted, became a tool for something far older and far darker than Salem. This documentary is compiled from reconstructed testimonies, suppressed church archives, and fictionalized interpretations of real historical patterns. Some names have been altered, some locations intentionally obscured, not to protect the innocent, but because certain doors, once opened, do not close again. In the winter of 1819, the town of Black Hollow, Massachusetts, vanished from official maps. No fire, no plague, no war, just silence. Black Hollow was a mill town built around an abandoned Puritan meeting house, one older than the town itself. The church had no recorded dedication date. Its cornerstone bore no name, only a symbol, 3 interlocked circles cut into stone. The first report came from a schoolteacher, Abigail Morse, who wrote to the state legislature describing episodes of collective trance among the town's children. She wrote that students would freeze mid-sentence, eyes unfocused, mouths moving without sound. When shaken, they would whisper the same phrase. She remembers us. Church elders dismissed it as nerves. Until the confessions began. Children accused parents. Wives accused husbands. Entire families accused themselves. But unlike Salem, there were no trials. There were transfers. Children were sent to church-run orphanages overnight. Adults were committed to religious asylums. Property deeds quietly changed hands. And always, the same question appeared in the clergy's private notes. Is the Tituba rite complete? No public record explains what that meant. But one surviving sermon fragment, dated February 3, 1819, reads, "The old tongue has returned. The vessel remembers her chains. Through her, we may bind again what God once loosed." Within 6 months, Black Hollow was empty. By 1820, the land was sold to the state. By 1832, the church was boarded shut. By 1901, the church burned down, officially by lightning. Yet locals claimed the fire started inside the altar. And beneath the ashes, investigators later found a cellar that did not exist on any blueprint. Its walls were scratched with fingernails and carved into the beam above the stairs. That same name, Tituba. To understand how Tituba became something other than human, we must confront an uncomfortable truth. She was never remembered as a person. She was remembered as a tool. In plantation records from the early 1800s, historians have found references to obedience ceremonies, religious instruction sessions where enslaved people were forced to reenact distorted versions of biblical punishment. In several cases, these ceremonies were referred to as Tituba lessons, not because she taught them, but because her story was used. A slave woman accused. A woman whose voice was rewritten by men. A woman who survived by speaking the language of her captors. Churches learned something from Salem. Not that witch trials were wrong, but that fear, when ritualized, creates obedience. By the mid-19th century, certain Protestant sects began incorporating confession cycles into orphanage discipline. Children were isolated, accused of invisible sins, forced to name one another as corrupting influences. The language used in these institutions mirrors courtroom transcripts from 1692, almost word for word. And in the margins of one 1874 orphanage ledger in Virginia, a nun wrote, "The Tituba method yields faster repentance. Children stopped speaking their native languages, stopped remembering their families, stopped resisting. They learned to confess before they were accused." This was not witchcraft. This was psychological enslavement. Tituba's name became shorthand for a process. Break identity, rewrite memory, bind obedience to fear. And the most disturbing part? It worked. The seminary did not appear on any map. Officially, it was listed as a preparatory theological residence. Unofficially, locals called it the Quiet House, because nothing living ever stayed loud there for long. Founded in 1903 on the outskirts of rural Pennsylvania, the seminary accepted boys between the ages of 10 and 14. Most were orphans. Others were children of families who had fallen from grace. The church promised discipline, salvation, and purpose. What it delivered was erasure. Daily schedules were rigid. Speech was limited. Names were temporary. Each boy was assigned a number for the first year. Names, they were told, were a privilege, something to be earned back through obedience. The chapel walls were bare except for one carving behind the pulpit, 3 interlocking circles, the same symbol found in Black Hollow. In the seminary's rulebook, recovered decades later, one passage stands out. The vessel must be emptied before it can be filled. Memory is resistance. Silence is submission. Once a week, the boys were taken to the lower chambers beneath the chapel, rooms not listed in the architectural plans. There, clergy conducted what they called remembrance sessions. Candles were lit. Eyes were covered. A voice recited a story, always the same story. A woman accused. A woman forced to confess. A woman whose words were never her own. The boys were instructed to repeat her confession until their voices blended together. And at the end, they were asked a single question. Who spoke through her? There was only one acceptable answer. She did. In 1921, a young archivist named Daniel Mercer was assigned to catalog old seminary records before the building was sold. Mercer was meticulous, quiet, unquestioning, until he opened the locked drawer. Inside were transcripts, handwritten, brittle, yellowed, dated between 1903 and 1918. Each transcript documented confessions from children, not sins, dreams, nightmares, recurring visions, a woman behind glass, a mouth sewn shut, and always the same phrase scrawled in red ink at the bottom of the page. Tituba remembered. Mercer's private journal, discovered years later, reveals his growing unease. These are not religious records. They are instructions, a system refined over centuries. He noted that clergy rotated frequently, never staying longer than 3 years. But the methods never changed. The words never changed. One transcript described a boy who refused to speak during sessions. The punishment was isolation in a stone room beneath the seminary. After 7 days, the boy spoke again, but not in his own voice. Mercer wrote that the handwriting in later records began to shift, becoming uneven, frantic, as if multiple hands were writing at once. When he attempted to report his findings, the drawer disappeared. So did Mercer. Officially, he resigned and moved west. No census record ever places him anywhere else. By the 1930s, religion had learned something crucial. Faith was no longer enough. Fear needed authority. In 1932, a state-run psychiatric facility in upstate New York began experimenting with what it called group memory therapy. Patients, many institutionalized children, were placed in shared dormitories and subjected to synchronized confession exercises. The lead psychiatrist dismissed spiritual explanations. He called it behavioral correction. But the language used in patient notes is hauntingly familiar. Subject exhibits dissociative compliance. Identity suppression successful. External narrative accepted as internal truth. One nurse's diary, later leaked, tells a different story. She wrote of children waking up screaming the same name, of mirrors being removed because patients refused to look into them, of a phrase whispered during sleep. She learned to survive by lying. Therapy sessions ended with a chant, presented as grounding technique, translated loosely as, "The voice is not yours. The voice is older. The voice keeps you safe." No official document explains where this chant came from, but a margin note in one file reads, derived from colonial confession models. From Salem, from Tituba, between 1910 and 1945, at least 12 small American towns were quietly dissolved. No disasters, no epidemics, no headlines, just gradual evacuation. In every case, the same pattern appears. A church renovation, a new orphan intake, a surge in moral correction programs, an increase in disappearances labeled as relocation, property transferred to trusts, records sealed for privacy. And in each town's remaining structures, investigators later found the same symbol carved into wood or stone. 3 interlocked circles. One town, Hawthorne Ridge, was investigated briefly in 1948. A federal agent wrote in his report, "Residents display collective amnesia regarding prior events. When pressed, they exhibit distress and repeat rehearsed phrases." One phrase stood out. "We were told not to remember her." The agent requested further inquiry. The file was classified. 2 weeks later, the investigation was reassigned. Hawthorne Ridge ceased to exist the following year. The land was converted into a church retreat. And beneath the retreat's main hall, according to ground-penetrating surveys never released to the public, lies a sealed chamber, with walls scratched by fingernails, and a name carved over and over again. War does not create monsters. It gives them permission. When the United States entered World War II, the nation needed obedience more than belief. Speed over morality. Silence over doubt. Institutions that had spent a century perfecting psychological submission suddenly found themselves useful again. In 1941, several inactive religious facilities were quietly reopened, not as churches, but as training and rehabilitation centers. Their purpose was vague. Their funding was unquestioned. One such facility stood in rural Maryland, officially designated as a behavioral adjustment institute. It trained chaplains, medics, and counselors assigned to deal with morale instability. But beneath the main building, unchanged since the 1800s, was a chamber locals called the confessional vault. Men sent there were not criminals. They were soldiers who asked too many questions. They were taught a simple truth. Individual conscience is a liability. Group survival requires surrender. The instructors never mentioned Tituba by name. They didn't have to. The structure of the sessions, the forced narratives, the repetition, the confession before accusation, had been perfected long ago. One trainee wrote in a letter never sent, "They say the voice I hear isn't mine anymore, that it's older, that it knows how to endure." The letter ends mid-sentence. The man was declared fit for duty the following week. By the 1940s, Tituba was no longer remembered as a woman. She had become a shape, a placeholder for survival through surrender. In institutional art therapy programs, patients repeatedly drew the same figure, despite having no contact with one another. A woman standing behind glass, her face blurred, her mouth sewn shut. Psychologists called it archetypal projection. But one drawing, dated 1943, included a handwritten caption. She survived by letting them speak for her. This was the final transformation. The original trauma, enslavement, accusation, forced confession, had been stripped of context and weaponized. Tituba's story was no longer about injustice. It was about endurance through erasure. And that lesson was taught carefully. In seminaries, in orphanages, in asylums, in wartime programs. The message was always the same. If you surrender your voice, you will survive. If you resist, you will be broken. That is not folklore. That is doctrine. In 1947, a church archivist in Georgia broke protocol. Her name was Ruth Calder. She had spent her life preserving sermons, baptism records, and burial logs. She believed in order, in history as something stable, until she found the box. Unlabeled, untitled, sealed with wax instead of tape. Inside were audio transcripts, interviews recorded on fragile acetate discs, voices of former orphans, seminarians, and patients. All adults, all terrified. One man said, "They never told us what we were confessing to, only that if we spoke first, we would be spared." Another whispered, "They said Tituba learned how to disappear inside herself. They said that's what God wanted." The final recording is different. A woman speaks calmly. She wasn't a witch. She was a rehearsal. Ruth attempted to submit the materials to a university archive. The box vanished. Ruth was dismissed for clerical irregularities. She died 5 years later. Her personal papers contain one final note. "If you find this, Do not look for her face. Look for the system that needed her. In 1949, the federal government quietly decommissioned several institutions tied to experimental behavioral programs. Buildings were sealed, records destroyed, land repurposed. Publicly, the era of moral correction ended. Privately, its lessons were absorbed elsewhere. The last known reference to the Tituba method appears in a classified memorandum dated December 12, 1949. One line survives. The narrative model has reached saturation. Further use risks exposure. Exposure to what? Not to witchcraft. To the truth. That America learned how to break people long before it learned how to protect them. That slavery did not end, it adapted. That a woman's stolen voice became a blueprint. By mid-century, Tituba's name disappeared again. Not because the system failed, but because it no longer needed to say her name out loud. History often ends stories too early. It closes the book when institutions shut down, when files are sealed, when names disappear from official language. But trauma does not end when buildings are abandoned. It migrates. By the early 1950s, thousands of children who passed through orphanages, seminaries, and correction programs entered adulthood. On paper, they were normal citizens. Teachers, clerks, preachers, parents. Inside, many described the same sensation. An absence where memory should be. Psychiatrists of the era referred to it as benign dissociation, a harmless coping mechanism, a sign of resilience. But patient journals tell another story. One man wrote, "I feel like I am performing myself." A woman described hearing her own thoughts as if spoken by someone else. Many reported the same dream. A woman behind glass. Watching. Waiting. Always silent. These adults raised families in towns built over buried institutions. They attended churches that inherited the same doctrine without the language. Obedience became virtue. Silence became faith. Questioning became sin. And no one could explain why. Across America, there are churches that have never been renovated. Not because of preservation. Because no one can agree on what's beneath them. In multiple cases, renovation attempts were halted after workers reported finding sealed staircases, hidden chambers, or foundations older than the buildings themselves. In one Midwestern town, a contractor described opening a false wall beneath the pulpit. Inside was nothing, just words carved repeatedly into the stone. Not prayers, not scripture. A name, removed before photographs could be taken. Church leadership called it vandalism. The workers quit. Sunday services continued. Some towns didn't disappear. They adapted. In these places, children learned early not to ask certain questions. Why does no one talk about the old orphanage? Why is that building locked? Why do the adults go silent when certain names come up? The answer was always the same. That was before. Before what? No one knew. Local folklore blamed fires, floods, economic collapse. But in every case, census records show population drops that make no sense. Entire age groups missing. Whole families gone without explanation. And yet, no collective grief. Just absence. As if forgetting had been agreed upon. Despite suppression, stories resist burial. In the 1960s and 70s, fragments surfaced in unexpected places. A graduate thesis rejected for speculative connections. A journalist's notes lost before publication. A folk song recorded once and never again. Each fragment mentioned a woman accused of things she didn't understand. A woman who learned to survive by surrendering her voice. A woman whose confession became a template. None named her directly, but the shape was unmistakable. Tituba was no longer a historical figure. She was a pattern trying to remember itself. There is a reason this story never fully disappears. It is not because of ghosts. It is not because of curses. It survives because the mechanism still exists. Modern America tells itself that the past is settled, that slavery ended, that witch hunts were irrational relics, that institutions have reformed. But history is not a sequence of closed doors. It is a corridor, and some rooms are still in use. The story of Tituba is not remembered because remembering her forces a question too uncomfortable to ask. How many systems were built by perfecting silence? How many people learned survival by erasing themselves? And how many of us still mistake obedience for morality? Tituba's forced confession was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. In 1972, during the digitization of colonial records, a graduate student flagged an inconsistency. A church ledger from the 1800s referenced a Tituba protocol. Not a person, a protocol. Before the finding could be reviewed, the ledger was reclassified. The student's advisor warned him privately. Some things aren't dangerous because they're untrue. They're dangerous because they explain too much. The file was never reopened, but the phrase remains in internal indexes. A ghost entry. Waiting. Psychologists today might call her a symbol, a trauma echo, a shared unconscious image. But symbols do not emerge without cause. The woman behind glass, mouth sewn shut, watching silently, represents something America has practiced for centuries. Survival through enforced voicelessness. Tituba lived because she spoke what others demanded. America remembered her because that lesson was useful. Not supernatural, not mystical, practical, efficient, terrifying. This is where the story ends. Not with a revelation, not with justice, but with recognition. Tituba was not the horror. She was the evidence. Evidence of how fear becomes structure, how institutions outlive their creators, how silence can be taught, inherited, normalized. Her name was buried not to protect the present, but to prevent the future from seeing itself clearly. And now you know why the story was never meant to be told this way. Because once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. And some systems depend on that blindness to survive.